Chris Timm joins us now. He is the Executive Director of the Maine Maritime Museum in Bath. Chris, thank you for joining us on today's first edition of Auction Waves.
Thank you.
I'd like to throw out a general question to open. Maine is a long way from Japan, and during the age of sail, that distance must have seemed much more daunting than it does even to us today. So how common was it, generally speaking, in the middle of the 19th century for Maine ships and Maine crews to travel that far from their accustomed waters?
That's a great question. It became surprisingly common. The 19th century was really a remarkable century for Maine ships and their crews. At the beginning of the century, it really was focused on the Atlantic. Maine ships were bringing cotton from the south to European ports, bringing luxury goods back. And then in the mid-century, with the opening of Chinese ports, Shanghai, Hong Kong in 1842, Yokohama in 1859, Kobe in 1863, there was just an explosion of interest in the trade and culture of Japan. And Maine ships played a major role in that. By the end of the century, there was really just kind of territorial ambitions in the Pacific. The Guano Islands Act of 1856 brought, for the first time, territories outside the continental U.S. Into American reach, and trade with Japan and Hawaii was incredibly common. In fact, it's a pretty local story here in Maine, too, because the Sewell shipbuilding family was a prominent shipbuilding family in Bath. And by the end of the century, their ships were coming to and from Yokohama, Kobe, and then they were also stopping off at Hawaii on their way back to California. And one of the Sewell sons was actually a foreign minister there. So he was managing the trade, and it was kind of just the thing to watch on a day-to-day basis was American ships and Maine ships coming to and from Japan. So it's remarkable just how much changed in a century.
And that happened rather quickly. Japan didn't really open up to the West until the late 1850s, early 1860s with the Perry expedition. The relationship between Japan and the West was all but non-existent for several hundred years before that, except perhaps for some Dutch traders. But American whalers had operated in Japanese territorial waters prior to the official opening. What would you say the role was of these whaling ships in opening trade?
They played a significant role. They were certainly active in the Pacific. And when Commodore Perry arrived in Japan, that was one of the kind of rationales he gave for why it was important to open up Japanese ports, both as a coaling station for refueling, but also just as kind of a refuge for whaling ships. I think we should have a little bit of healthy skepticism towards that rationale. Certainly that played into it, but certainly his charge was much more to open the ports for trade. So the dollars that they were seeing in terms of trade coming out of as a potential for Japan, I think played a little bit more in what they were seeing European countries and their colonies, frankly, exploiting out of the Pacific. That, I think, played as much, if not probably a greater role than protecting the whaling vessels and providing them a safe harbor. But that certainly was a facet to it.
And there's really no coincidence, I would imagine, that this was happening around the same time that the West Coast of North America was opening up to white tradings.
Exactly. I mean, there is, the 1850s, when you think of just Manifest Destiny in California, and it's kind of around that point that what we consider the continental U.S. as a kind of territorial whole is being formed. So then that was kind of a natural point in our country's history to look, to the Pacific, to Chinese ports, to Japanese ports. But then also that was kind of where American traders started stopping off at Hawaii, and then ultimately that would become a territory as well.
Now, certainly you can see from Japan's point of view that they might not be particularly happy to see gunboats sailing into their harbor with the attitude of, hey, trade with us. You know, gunboat diplomacy became an actual phrase around that time, which is basically what Perry's mission was. And for many years, the Japanese had maintained a policy where Western sailors were not even permitted to set foot on Japanese soil. So I want to think a minute about the ordinary Japanese people, not the politicians, not the shoguns, not the leaders in the governments. How did the average Japanese citizen view all of this? Were they curious about the West? And were the American crews curious about Japan?
That's a great question. With all those restrictions, it is a bit hard to say because, frankly, then those interactions until the ports were opened were in fact fairly rare. We do have some isolated accounts where there was a lot of interest in seeing American vessels from the shore, but that really kind of became much more prevalent, and we have more insight after the Yokohama Treaty and Perry's expedition. And we actually have a woodcut in our collection that was done shortly after that, and it shows incredible interest in the American ships visiting Yokohama port. And you know, the Japanese artist is detailing it, you know, pretty specifically and with great detail the costume, the rigging that's kind of particular to American vessels. So I think there was a lot of interest in we were as exotic to them as Japan was to American travelers. So there was interest in that and in the technologies, which were different than what Japanese citizens were familiar with at the time. So kind of an interest in the technology and the costume is kind of an interesting early avenue of entry.
Now, there had been contacts earlier on, largely involving shipwrecked sailors, shipwrecked American sailors ending up in Japanese territory, and shipwrecked Japanese sailors being picked up by American vessels. How did those interactions play into the attitudes between the two countries, would you say?
It depended on the situation. There were some situations where it was very cordial and they were returned, and then there were other situations where, okay, well, it was illegal to be setting foot, so you might be imprisoned. But that evolved really significantly later in the 19th century, and then shipwrecks really became a kind of a major cross-cultural moment. For example, a Sewell vessel, so I mentioned the Sewell shipbuilding family, by the name of the Chesborough, wrecked off of Japan in 1889, and it was near the town of Suguru. And there were only 4 survivors, 17 sailors perished. But the survivors were taken ashore, were kept warm by the Suguru residents, and that act of kindness actually established a really strong friendship between Bath and Suguru, and it actually lives to this day. Bath is a sister city to the town of Suguru based on that shipwreck moment.
It isn't really that long ago.
No, it really isn't.
In terms of the cosmic stream of time
Exactly.
that all of these events have happened.
And it's wonderful. There's still student exchanges that happen regularly between the two towns. So it shows that kind of maritime connection between Maine and Japan is really strong and lasting.
So when New England mariners who visited Japan in these early years of the opening relationship found their way back home, what stories did they bring with them? How did they describe their experiences to the people back home? How did it build the perception of what Japanese culture was like in the United States?
That's a great question. And one of the things that's fun going through our collection of 21,000 artifacts is we have a lot that can kind of shed light on those attitudes. And honestly, it's as varied as the individuals that are bringing, that had these experiences. For example, we have 2 artifacts in our collection. One is a silver fukusa, so kind of a gift wrapping, embroidered silk. It depicts, this beautiful scene of cranes and reeds with silver thread, and that was collected by Captain Wiley Dickinson, and actually on the perimeter of that, there's an amazing pencil kind of inscription. It's by his daughter, Bessie, and it notes kind of just with fondness of like, my dad collected this in Kobe, in 18, I think it was 89, And we actually have her diaries. And so you have all this insight of she traveled with her father. And so there's all these like wonderful stories of like being with dad at sea and in these foreign ports. And so to have her notes on that, you could tell it's a really personal and kind of warm experience. And they really enjoyed the people that they met in Japan. On the other side of things, we actually have a photograph of his brother, John Dickinson. In that photograph, John is with his family. It's a pretty staged photograph, so it's a studio photograph. His son Vincent is sitting in a rickshaw. This might be a little bit of projection based on what we know, but John looks a little grumpy in the photograph. And we have his notes, too, of his experience. And he just had a horrible time. He hated the trip over there. They faced a gale on the way over there. When they arrived to Kobe, it was under quarantine for smallpox. He was kind of grumpy the whole time. He got into a little bit of mix with the local U.S. consul. And he wrote in his diary as he left, he complained that their pilot, as they left the harbor, didn't speak English, which is... shouldn't be surprised for an American audience in Japan that they would in fact speak Japanese. And in the end, he wrote, "I'm just so happy to be out of this mean place." So that kind of shows the breadth. In one family, you can have two very different attitudes and kind of receptions to just what is that attitude towards travel. And we can probably all relate to that to a certain degree. There's people who love that cultural immersion, and then there's people who don't necessarily make the most out of it.
It seems kind of unusual for an entire family to make such a risky trip at that particular point in history. They weren't exactly traveling on an ocean liner. How common was it for mariners to take their families along on these voyages?
It was somewhat common because you would be gone for a long time. So it would kind of depend on your family's situation. But certainly if you wanted to be seeing your loved ones and you're going to be gone for a year and a half, 2 years, that's kind of one of your options is to take them with you. And it was not, for a lot of these vessels going over there, it was not roughing it in the captain's quarters. I mean, these were exotic wood veneer interiors, upholstered sofas. That was unique to the captain's quarters. But at the same time, it was almost like a little mini studio apartment. So it was a pretty luxe experience.
So these captains would have been accustomed to fine objects of art. Would they be looking for these when they arrived in Japan?
Yes. So as you pick up well, sometimes our association of the Maine sea captain is this kind of grizzled, maybe in a yellow jacket, a pipe. At this period in the 19th century, these are accomplished business people. They know their way around the sea, absolutely. But I mean, they were in charge of what cargo are you going to be picking up? What's the best route to take from point A to point B? I sometimes relate it to like trade is very complicated to a certain degree. If you're familiar with Uber and how that works, it's optimizing. Okay, you're picking something up someone here, dropping them off there. Then it's always what is the most efficient way. Who should you pick up next? That's basically how sea captains operated. They arrive in Kobe, they discharge their cargo, and they're thinking, okay, what can I make the most money to do next? So they were accomplished business people, but also really accomplished people of fine tastes. So when they arrive in port, they are looking at the kind of higher value good compared to maybe the rest of the crew. They're looking at commissioning portraits, silks, custom goods.
So you're sort of having a two-layered manifestation of trade. The crew might go ashore and perhaps visit the 19th century Japanese equivalent of a tourist trap.
Exactly.
And buy trinkets and whatnots and knickknacks, whereas the captain and perhaps the high officers of the ship would go to the shops in the more refined part of town and pick up artifacts with a pedigree, rare items, antiques that were even antiques in the 19th century. How willing were the Japanese to part with these items?
It certainly depends on the item, but what we kind of see, at least in our collection, is there's kind of two categories. There's the for lack of a better analogy, it is kind of, there were curio shops, which we could probably relate to an antique store today. And so that, as they navigated those stores, there probably was a bit of a limited knowledge of Japanese culture and history. So it would have to be kind of interpreted by the storekeeper, like probably a lot of different experiences. And so those kind of guided, oh, maybe you'd be interested in this, maybe you'd be interested in that. You could end up with pretty extraordinary and older works, being brought back home, or more recent. And then there are the kind of specifically commissioned works that were fairly popular. There's a category of work that we have a couple examples of in our collection, and they're kimono portraits. And essentially what they are is they're Western portraits of Western individuals, modeled in a way that kind of a Western audience would like to see. So it's more kind of volumetric, it's shaded, there's kind of depth to the face, which wasn't characteristic of kind of traditional Japanese art at the period. But then they're in kimono garb, so it's Westerners in kind of dress-up garb of Japanese wear. And we know that those would be commissioned typically either from the family member that was with you along that voyage, but also often photographs that captains and officers would bring. So they would say, hey, could you paint my daughter in a kimono wear? And in fact, one of our kimono portraits we have was commissioned by a sea captain of his daughter and her two college friends. So it's that was probably a really amazing gift to come back from. And as you can imagine, it's a kind of a perennial example of a father trying to impress his daughter and her friends, which I can relate to as a father of a daughter.
It certainly does seem that there were a lot of these mariners who were acting almost in a curatorial way in bringing these artifacts over. But do we know of other sailors that were more interested in just simply accumulating a lot of cool stuff to put in their cabinet of curiosities?
That's a great, it did obviously depend on the situation. A lot of times it was so much of why these objects were valued in terms of how we see how they were recorded and kind of remembered was this was collected at Port X in year Y when I was aboard ship Z. So
it was almost a visual ship's log.
It is, and then it's a way. We have a lot of photographs of Bath sea captain interiors, which would have been exorbitant, beautifully decorated with a lot of these different artifacts. And I think it is. That collection was a status of wealth, of prestige, of worldliness. So that's something that, and then it would invite storytelling as well. So you could kind of say, oh, yes, you're interested in this embroidery over here. Well, I picked that up when I was in Kobe, and let me tell you about the voyage. So
that's almost a stereotype of the Maine sea captain as he goes through his parlor and points to the various artifacts and takes a deep draw on his pipe and tells this long, drawn-out story that may or may not be true. And I guess that did have basis in reality.
I think there certainly is that. People love to tell stories about what they've done, and those kind of those are a wonderful kind of visual tool to remember. But I think what is a little maybe surprising, it isn't just okay the scrimshaw whale's tooth and this the kind of the stereotypical as you would say. It is worldly goods that may be from Europe, maybe from Japan, maybe from Polynesia. We do have records of kind of incredible small collections that were set up to tell these kind of tales of a family or an individual's prestige and wealth.
And they tend to be passed down through the generations verbally rather than being written down. Do we have ways to track the provenance of these items?
We do, and I think one of the things that's remarkable about kind of the provenance that we know when these objects come into our museum's collection is so often they are kept for 100 years within a family. So this hasn't been transferred. There wasn't necessarily. I'm sure there was a secondary market for some objects that were brought back, but predominantly they were kept and valued within a family. for 100 years plus, and ultimately it just becomes too much for a family to hold on to, or there's enough family heirlooms that there's kind of a reprioritization. But that's remarkable that these objects lived on in single families for that long, because it really shows the incredible pride and kind of how much they were valued for their specific stories. And it wasn't just an object to be traded. It was something really tied to a family's history.
You can almost imagine the granddaughter at her grandfather's knee being told for the 1,000th time the story of this lacquer box. And every time the story is told, it gets more and more elaborate, to the point where perhaps the reality is absorbed into the story. But it's still a lacquer box that somebody bought or was presented to them or given to them. And the artifact itself is its own story, would you say?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that from our museum's perspective, I mean, that adds so much depth to the story of these objects. There's a specific story that, say, an artifact from Japan has. What individual made it? Whereabouts in the country was this made? What was the association for a Japanese audience of this object? Was it something that was valued for kind of a local audience, or was it something specifically designed and fabricated for export, which there are examples? But that, to me, that adds that complexity and those kind of different layers of meanings. And then how was it interpreted by the family for 100 years after that is part of the richness of the story.
One of the things that we have featured in our upcoming auction, we have a number of Japanese woodblock prints. And in researching the history of these, we find that a lot of the prints that were made after the 1850s were being made specifically for Western buyers rather than for domestic consumption. And this trend continued on well into the 20th century. How common would you say that was for other types of items? Did the Japanese, in the 1860s, early 1870s, start thinking in terms of the Western market and manufacturing these items on demand, or perhaps even in bulk for later resale?
That's a great question. We definitely see that in our artifacts. Sometimes, for example, in porcelain, it's the motifs that are being featured. So there is a sophisticated awareness from the Japanese production side of what entices a Western audience. And in silks, for example, we have accounts where it was pretty early established that kind of a purple dyed silk with gold embroidery wasn't maybe always the staple kind of for a local audience. It certainly was an option, but that Western audiences really liked that. There's kind of long kind of seeded associations with royalty of purple and gold. It's just opulent. So that was something that in particular you can kind of see play out in a collection. Oh, there's a lot of kind of one particular, very opulent color patterns being used here, because that was to a certain degree what the Western buyers wanted.
And you see other motifs that recur over and over. The moonlit scene of the pagoda by the waterside. You can't go wrong with anything like that. Chrysanthemums, all of the things that are stereotypically associated with Japanese art seem to have been really popular in the West at this time, and it feels like they were manufacturing these things to order.
Very much so. Like going back to the Kimono Portraits, while certainly Mount Fuji features in Japanese art, dedicated for a local audience, it's very conspicuous and very consistent in a lot of the Kimono Portraits, because it grounds the portraiture for a Western audience in kind of a sense of place. Okay, I have a recognizable geography that I'm looking at here. And the other interesting thing is you kind of talked a little bit about the production aspect. We know that a lot of times those Kimono Portraits were kind of prepared in advance, so that the kimono is painted in, the background is painted in, and then they're just waiting for a prospective buyer to say, okay, here's either a photograph of my loved one, I would like you to complete this image for, because when you think about it, they might have limited time while they're in port, or they're passing through different areas. So you need to be able to produce that work very quickly. So that kind of pre-prep in the artwork is an interesting thing to see evidence of.
Your face here.
Exactly. I mean, when you think of like kind of the tourist shops today of photographs, I'd love to be a cowboy, or I'd love to be. Some of these things are very human and long-standing.
Well,
trends.
it really isn't any different from the way that we will sell someone a sweatshirt with a lobster on it.
Exactly.
Even if we don't particularly care for lobster ourselves.
Yep. Even in vacation land, we know a thing or two about what maybe what an internal audience would really like, and then also what a visitor on travel would like.
And I think thinking in those terms, it really does make it seem more immediate. Mm-hmm. That the motivations of people really haven't changed all that much in a century and a half. Mm-hmm. We're still acquisitive people who enjoy having things around us that remind us of a happy time in our lives, mm-hmm. or perhaps even vicariously living through the happy times of others, mm-hmm. remembering that somebody in the 19th century had a trip to Japan and brought this souvenir back home with them. Mm-hmm. But we also see by certainly the end of the 19th century and the turn of the 20th, we see import agents becoming involved, mm-hmm. on a much larger scale and buying Japanese goods and bringing them to the United States in bulk, mm-hmm. for resale. Is there a difference in the type of artifact that this was, or do you see them being pretty much the same types of things that sailors would have acquired on trips?
That's a good question. I think obviously you see the kind of two-spec production with that, but a lot of it is, and it depends certainly on the kind of level of the patron or the level of the buyer. But there is in terms of how they were sourcing it, it was in very similar shops and areas as someone actually within visiting, say, Kobe would be sourcing their materials from, because the trade ports really were set up to cater to not only the kind of one-off a captain or an officer stopping by, but someone that might say, oh, I like that, I'll take 10 of those. But it is interesting, here in Maine, we're the artifacts that we have in terms of the provenance tied to Maine buyers is much more focused on those that personally collected them overseas. A lot of the export market might first be unloaded in, say, California, rather than coming all the way back to Maine.
And you see a lot of dealers and wholesalers based in New York and Boston handling bulk quantities of these goods, and you'll find them today with gallery stamps on the bottom of them from like 1915.
Exactly.
So, but the maritime artifacts were a different breed.
Mm-hmm. And that provenance of, for example, in an artifact that we might have in our collection, we can trace it back to the original family whose captain went to Kobe or Yokohama, and that's a key kind of detail of for what purposes was this originally bought? Not only you might have some details, but it's a good clue that, this was actually brought back personally rather than acquired in, say, New York, as you were saying.
Were there mariners who sort of had a foot in both camps? I'm thinking of, crewmen who go ashore and figure it would be a nice side hustle, mm-hmm. to import bulk quantities of artifacts, mm-hmm. novelties, gewgaws, knickknacks, mm-hmm. things that they could sell easily on the sly. Did this happen, and was it something that was condoned by captains?
Mm-hmm. That's a good. I'm sure it happened. I wouldn't discount it as a possibility, but one of the challenges of if you're just a crew member, and particularly in this period, is the disparity in your funds is just so stark. Ships had what are called a slop chest aboard, and essentially that was kind of the general store for any goods that you may have forgotten to pack before you left for port, but it also had a lot of essentials as well. And we have so many records that of crew members that actually would be, they would arrive at the end of a voyage indebted to their ship owner rather than actually flush with cash, because it was a captive audience aboard. And if you wanted a little liquor, or if you wanted a little, you needed a new jacket because yours got a hole in it and you're going through a squall, the ship owners would be happy to sell you that aboard. at probably like 8 times the price normally. So the discretionary income that a lot of crew members had when they arrived at port was quite small. It was probably just for a nice time at the pub and decompress rather than really sourcing. But I'm sure there were a few diligent souls with an entrepreneurial bent.
And I would imagine there might have been a few captains or first officers who indulged in a bit of this as well.
Yeah, we have occasional records of that, so that certainly did happen. But we see so much more often it's for their family or also potential gift giving for political reasons or for affluence. So it might even be a fellow, another businessman in town or the mayor. Oh, I'd love to present this to you for kind of your own ambitions and aspirations. So the fact that these things were valued beyond almost just their monetary, it's something that not anyone could go out and simply buy, made them a really precious commodity.
It would be a good way for a captain perhaps to ingratiate himself with the owner of the shipping company, to bring him a kimono with a dragon on the back of it.
Precisely.
Or something like that.
Precisely. To think, you weren't able to join me on this voyage, but A, I brought you a great profit in the cargoes that I delivered, and also here, please sign me up for your next voyage. I'd love to.
Exactly. You remember the person who gives you a lavish gift.
Exactly, yeah.
Is it ever possible, or is it even advisable for us to separate any specific individual trade artifact from its history as a trade artifact? I mean, if I had an antique Japanese vase, would it ever be possible for that to simply be an antique Japanese vase without also seeing it as an artifact of American trade relations? Or I guess what I'm asking is the history of the object become an inseparable part of the object itself?
I love that question. From a museum perspective, I mean, we certainly like to kind of, as a starting point, whatever someone's interest or hook in an object at the outset is something that we want to embrace. So if someone comes to our museum and just loves the way a vase looks, and that's kind of what first sparks their interest, that we want to embrace that and allow that to be the entry point to an object. But absolutely, from a one of our duties is to talk about the social context, the historical context of an object, and from that perspective, then you really do want to make sure that you're weaving in. Okay, yes, it's beautiful. Yes, you might choose to put this in your own home. That's a wonderful entry point. But then to talk about its history as both something that was produced in a specific location at a specific time and was sold for particular kind of exchange for a individual, and what was their interest and what was their background. So I think ultimately, any entry point, whether it's from a purely aesthetic or kind of connoisseurship perspective, that's certainly something to embrace. But ultimately, I think making sure that we can kind of continue to tell the stories behind these objects. They are far more complicated and fascinating objects when you think about their full history of what brought them from point A to point B to the present.
And especially so if the artifact comes to you with a story attached, and you're perhaps the first person outside of the family in 150 years to own it. What would you say would be the best way for someone to live up to that responsibility? In terms, are there resources that they can consult to better understand the origin of their piece?
That's a great, yeah. So from a museum perspective, we normally kind of advise people to think about the physical and then the intellectual preservation of an object. So physical is kind of a little easier to kind of think about at the offsets. It's, is it in a safe location? If it's a delicate object, trying to handle it as limited as possible, keeping it away from UV light, keeping it away from smoke environments, things like that. But preserving the kind of intellectual history of an object is just as important. So that's, if someone acquires an object, make a note of, how did you acquire it? Was there an interesting story that was told about it? Even if you didn't necessarily buy that story, it's really important. You never know how 10 years later, 100 years later, that might actually be a really interesting clue, or it might just be a fun story to have with the object as well. And then certainly there's so many resources for collectors to consider, museums, historical societies, have incredible genealogical information if you have a name associated with an object. We have great comparanda, for example, at the museum. We have 21,000 artifacts. And comparanda is just a fancy art historical term for just things that are similar to it. So if you have a porcelain vase, it's kind of interesting to see, oh, is there one exactly like this? You thought it was a one of a kind, but that might actually help reveal a little bit like, oh, this was done in a factory or this was customized. That's a really helpful resource. And then we also have 3,000 linear feet of archival material here. And when you think of like sheets of paper stacked together, that's 10 football fields length of just documents, diaries, logbooks, receipts. So museums like ours, historical societies like ours, are kind of treasure troves for doing a little more research about, if you have a name, if you have a location that a work is associated with, or just as a starting point to help reveal a little bit more about an object.
So if you bought a sword, for example, and there were Japanese characters stamped on the tang of that sword, and it came with a story that perhaps a sea captain brought it home from Kobe in 1890, there's a chance that you might be able to perhaps track down all the voyages that sailed from Maine to Kobe in 1890.
Exactly. We have incredible records related to that here. We also have a captain's and a ship index. So if you know the name of a captain, we actually can look that up, and then we might have archival records related to that. Same thing if you know a name of a ship, we can look that up as well. And we're really kind of delighted to help with that. I mean, not only is that our mission to share research, we really kind of appreciate, even if it isn't your intent to one day donate to a museum, although as a museum, we always love to be a cultural repository for precious items. It's really helpful just for us to have on our radar of like the remarkable objects that are out there. So we always find those conversations, we love to help research requests, but it also, we benefit just even from kind of knowing better what is the breadth of objects out there. So those are always really kind of rewarding conversation and partnerships.
We have one particular item in this auction that has generated a tremendous amount of interest. It's a small bronze figure of a crab that's articulated at all joints that would be on an actual crab. And when you hold it, it actually feels like you're holding an actual crab. And this is something that was very popular in Japan after the fall of the shoguns. The armorers turned to manufacturing these novelties as a way of demonstrating their proficiency. Have you ever dealt with an object like that here?
That's interesting. I would have to double check. I haven't seen anything like that in our collection, at least, although I will confess we have 21,000 artifacts. So it's, you can imagine even if you had 21,000 children, they would all be near and dear to you, but you might forget and not lay eyes on a few of them. So I haven't personally seen an object like that, but it sounds remarkable. And I love, your connection with armor making makes a lot of sense, of just using that skill of metalwork and articulation in a different mode is fascinating. So how interesting.
Well, thank you very much, Chris Timm. We appreciate you joining us today for the first edition of Auction Waves. We encourage you to take a look at our online auction catalog, and who knows, maybe you could take that crab home.
I'll look into it. Sounds fantastic. And thanks so much for visiting today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you very much.